Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Respected scholars, elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum. Tonight I will spend a few minutes talking about two supplications from Sahifa Sajadiyya, dua numbers 15 and 23. Both of these duas remind us of our dependence on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and different aspects of our lives. Dua number 15 is a supplication for good health. In this beautiful prayer, Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam asked Allah to bless him with physical well-being, protection from illness, and strength in his body. However, this dua is not just about physical health, it also connects to our spiritual health as well. It also, the Imam reminds us that health is a blessing from Allah and we should use it in obedience to Him. When we are healthy, we must be grateful, and when we face illness, we must be patient and seek healing from the one who has control over all things. Dua number 23 is a supplication for the removal and assuaging of worries and distress. In this heartfelt plea, the Imam turns to Allah during times of hardship, acknowledging that no difficulty is too great for Allah to ease. This dua teaches us that struggles are temporary and that true relief comes from putting our trust in Allah and having tawakkul. It reminds us that no matter how overwhelmed we feel, Allah's mercy is always near. Together, these duas show us two essential aspects of life: gratitude in times of ease and patience in times of hardship. We ask Allah for health and well-being, but when we do, we also should rely on Him to guide us through them. If we make these duas a part of our lives, we will not only strengthen our faith, but also find peace in every situation. Salawat.
Jazakallah for Sister Fatima Noor Muhammad's well-being, health and safety. Let's all recite a loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Brothers and sisters, it is now time for our speech and lecture tonight. It is my privilege to request Hujjatul Islam, Shayk Reza Hemyari, to the podium at this time. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
صلوا على محمد وعلى محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وبه نستعين إنه خير ناصر ومعين. ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين سيما بقية الله في الأراضين وحجته على الخلق أجمعين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. أما بعد. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In these past few nights that we've been together, we've been talking about this virtue called wisdom, hikmah, discernment, and it's a virtue that helps us make good decisions in our lives. And inshallah, with the grace of God, that will take us to living a good life. Those practical sort of steps, those practical decisions that we make, and that habit that, inshallah, if we are graced with wisdom, that we can have to make the good decisions. And also to, for example, deal with other people, to figure out when I should, for example, push and when I should take a step back, when I should give advice and when I should be silent. That is the general topic that we've been talking about. And last night, of course, we were commemorating the martyrdom of Amirul Mu'mineen, Imam Ali. And I'd like to just bring that conversation, that discussion to a close. Now, when we talk about wisdom, we're talking about a virtue, an akhlaq, a khulq. And generally, whenever we talk about khulq or akhlaq, we're talking about a virtue, or in another word, we're talking about a second nature. So, a lot of times when you think about akhlaq, we're thinking about good behavior, maybe even good adab, but that's not the extent of what akhlaq means. Akhlaq comes from the word khulq, and khulq is very similar to the word khalq. In other words, the creation or the nature that we have. So khulq is, in other words, not just our behavior, not even just our sort of habit, but it's almost like a disposition. It's when people, for example, when people look at me or when they think about me, what's the first thing that comes to their mind about who I am? I'm not talking about my name or where I am in the community or, for example, where I live or what citizen of what country I am. But what is the first thing they think about when they think about what type of person I am? That is one way of understanding what khulq is. So we're not, again, talking about our knowledge, my knowing how to be a charitable person, or even my doing and giving charity, or even my habit. I sometimes can get into the habit of becoming charitable. It's beyond all of that. It is about being a charitable person, so much so that it becomes a part of my bones. You can take my life, but you cannot take my charity from me, for example. Right? Generally, people are not like that. But usually, for people who we think about as being very generous or they're very courageous, he's willing to give his life for his principles. That's what bravery means. Right? It's a part of his soul, it's a part of his bones, it's a very part of his nature and his khulq. Now this is a very difficult task, right? We are trying to become a different person, in other words. We're trying to become, if I am not courageous, if I'm not brave, I am trying to become brave. That process means that I have to become someone other than I am. It's almost like changing my name, changing my identity, and changing the type of person that I am. So it's a really difficult sometimes task. But there are certain pieces of wisdom that Amirul Mu'mineen gives us, Imam Ali gives us, to help us along that path. One of those is this hadith mentioned in Nahjul Balagha, wherein Imam Ali says, Sallu ala Muhammad. He says, Kun samhan, wa la takun mubdiran or mubaddiran, wa kun muqaddiran, wa la takun muqattiran. Be generous without being extravagant. So be charitable, give charity, but don't be overly extravagant in how much you say give in charity. Understand that you have a limit, you have a budget, set a budget for yourself, and then within your budget, figure out how much disposable income you have, or maybe even beyond your disposable income. If it's a truly worthy cause, and if that person or that institution really needs it, maybe even cut back from your daily expenses and give that money in charity. But don't be overly extravagant. Be thrifty without being stingy. So now on the other hand, we're thinking about giving first, and then we're also thinking about saving. So be thrifty, Don't spend as much as possible for your own life, buying all the different things that I might see, getting into the habit of just constantly shopping online. And they make it really easy. You just press a button, and then it leaves your bank account, and then God knows what comes in the mail. Right? So be thrifty, but then don't be stingy. Especially when it comes to our families, we should try to spend as much as we can in terms of the budget that we have set for ourselves. Right? Don't be stingy when it comes to your family, when it comes to your community, and so on. Now, this is a small virtue. It's a small reference to a very specific type of virtue. And that is about spending from the material wealth that God has given us. It could be about time, it could be about the energy that we have, but specifically this seems to be referring to our wealth, our income, our money. But if we think about this hadith, it actually might open up a few doors to us in thinking about what it means to have virtue. Right? So we're thinking about not being stingy and not being extravagant, but something in between, right? In the middle, in the medium, that area where it's sometimes very difficult to figure out. When you ask scholars of akhlaq, they will tell us that there are two different theories about how this works. On the one hand, some scholars of akhlaq, they say that there is always this happy medium between being stingy on the low end and then being extravagant on the high end. And then that place in between is the charity and the place that you want to be. Okay, so when I'm thinking about what it means to be charitable, I shouldn't go above board when I'm thinking about the virtue that I have within myself, or nor should I think about going below board. Do we have that word, below board? Is that a saying? All right. So no going above and not going below. Okay? That's one way of looking at it. They talk about, for example, what it means to be brave. What does it mean to be brave? It's not about someone who is very they used to call them yellow-bellied. Somebody who's very scared constantly all the time. He doesn't want to put himself in any danger. And then, nor do you want to be a person who is what they would call foolhardy. He goes into the battle and he's forgotten all of his weapons and he doesn't know what to do. He has no training. He has no sort of idea about what it means to fight. And then he goes straight into the battle. So you don't want to be that person who doesn't think about preparing himself, nor do you want to be someone who is just scared all the time. You want to be somewhere in the middle. Other scholars of akhlaq, they will tell us that no, it's not about not having too much nor too little. But you try to be as brave as possible. You try to perfect this virtue, this akhlaq of bravery, this akhlaq of being charitable, this akhlaq of being kind, and this akhlaq of getting angry sometimes at the right moment. So if I want to be a brave person, I should be as brave as I could possibly be. It should become a part of my soul. When we have this hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Prophet says, "Bu'ithtu li'utammima makarim al-akhlaq." I have been sent to complete the most beautiful of akhlaq. So if we understand it in this way, the Prophet is saying, reach the pinnacles and the heights and the perfection of what it means to be charitable. My first instinct when somebody asks me something is to give. That's my first. It's almost like I am being pushed to give, almost out of my hands. Or, for example, if somebody says, now is the time to fight, now is the time to get up and do this thing, whatever it might be, right? Now is the time to go and give a speech. Now is the time to, for example, go and do this good act for the community. Or now is the time, I notice someone who's new in my community, I say, I should go and say salam, right? Immediately, without even thinking about it. That's my instinct. It's almost like part of my very being. Right? And this is a very good thing, particularly in our communities. When we find somebody who's new, we should go and say salam. That person has gone out of their comfort zone. They have tried to be brave and go outside of what they're used to. And we should also be brave in trying to go and meet them as well. Okay? So the second opinion, the second position, says that you should be as brave as you can possibly be. But what stops you from going out into the battle without preparing yourself? Coming up and giving a speech, for example, without writing your notes. Or looking at your charity. I've looked at my notes, don't worry. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Giving charity, but being overly extravagant. And that is, the difference is in the situation, the circumstance. Right? The circumstance. What does the circumstance require of me? And that's where wisdom comes in. I am as charitable as possible, but unfortunately my circumstances don't allow me to give more than I can. And the difference becomes also in, I will try to cut down on what I think I need for myself, and I try to give to the other person. When you think about perfecting virtue and perfecting your akhlaq, it means that you try to do as much as possible, but your circumstances don't allow you, and so you might even try to change your circumstances. Right? You might try to even work harder so that you can give to your community. If I just try to go in the middle, I might not go that extra step. That's the first thing. The second thing that Amir al-Mu'mineen teaches us is that we should, if we don't have these habits within us, I'm just not that charitable, I'm just not that brave, I should try to exert myself, try to get into the habit of doing certain things, of putting myself out there, of putting myself in situations where I have to make that decision. So the Imam says, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. إن لم تكن حليما تحلم. If you are not a person who is patient, then mimic, be like, try to impersonate, play the patient person on TV, right? Try to mimic that person who is patient. In other words, have an image or a model of patience in your mind. Try to be around people who are patient so that you know this person, if they were in my situation, they would be patient in this way. Become in the habit of doing it. Try to mimic someone who does it. Because rarely, the Imam says, قَلَّ فَإِنَّهُ قَلَّ مَنْ تَشَبَّهَ بِقَوْمٍ إِلَّا أَوْشَكَ أَنْ يَكُونَ بِهِمْ. There is, very rarely does someone mimic a people without becoming at least a little bit like those people. I try to mimic my celebrities in my life, the superstars in my life, and then I try to work hard to become like those people. I might not become the superstar, for example, of charity, or the bravest of people, but at least I'll take one step. And then, the third step that Amir al-Mu'mineen teaches us is to take account of that process that we have now begun to undertake. The first, again, was to figure out try to be as good as possible, as perfect in my charity, in my generosity, in my bravery as possible. The second was to, if I'm not at that level, then I should have a person in mind, or I should surround myself with people and say, for example, if this person was in my situation, then what would they do? And then I try to mimic them. And then I get into the habit. And I create those good habits. And then the Imam says, Man hasaba nafsahu rabiha. A person who takes himself to task profits. He takes account of his actions. He's constantly in the process of thinking, well, in this situation, I wasn't the best I could be. I didn't mimic my model, the person that I look up to, as best as I could. How could I change it? Then he says, whoever neglects his soul, وَمَنْ غَفِلَ عَنْهَا خَسِرَ. Whoever neglects his soul loses. وَمَنْ خَافَ أَمِنَ. Whoever fears God secures safety. I will read the rest, even though it's not directly related to my talk, but just because these are very beautiful lessons for all of us, we can benefit from them, inshallah. وَمَنْ اعْتَبَرَ أَبْصَرَ. Whoever heeds lessons, whoever takes lessons from the events that Allah places in his life, they will discern, they will see, and God will give them that insight. وَمَنْ أَبْصَرَ فَهِمَ. A person who discerns, they will understand. وَمَنْ فَهِمَ عَلِمَ. And whoever understands realizes the truth. So this is basically, the Imam is saying that there's a process going on. Right? Our life is a process, and the more we reflect, the more Allah opens doors, and then the more Allah opens doors for us, the more we understand. And the more we take account of ourselves, the more God gives us those opportunities to do better, to become a better person, to become that perfect human being that we are trying to become. As I said, we have to have models. And people who have acquired that perfection, they are the ones who have a very different state from what we might think about. So usually when we think about, for example, a person like Amirul Mu'mineen, Imam Ali, we're usually trying to attain an understanding of Islam. In other words, Amirul Mu'mineen, Imam Ali, or the rest of the A'immah become our means to understand, for example, Islam, or understand the Quran. They become, na'udhu billah, tools or instruments or the means to an end. And that is a very important aspect of the Ahlul Bayt. They are means to an end. They are means for us to get closer to Allah. There is this very famous hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, where the Prophet, he describes the status of Imam Ali in terms of, one instance it's in terms of haqq, and in another instance it's in terms of the Quran. So usually when we think of Amir al-Mu'mineen, we think about the Mufassirul Quran, right? When we think about Amir al-Mu'mineen, we think about Mufassirul Haqq, the person who describes and who teaches us what haqq is, or what the Quran tells us. Yes? So, when we look in this hadith, the first part of it makes sense. Aliyun ma'al haqq. But then when we get to the second part, it doesn't quite fit. Wal haqqu ma'a aliyin. In another hadith, this is a hadith from, yes, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. This is a hadith from the client of Abu Dhar. Abu Dhar, the famous companion of the Prophet, a man by the name of Abu Thabit. It is said that this man, he partook in the battle of Jamal. that battle that very famously the wife of the Prophet, she, along with some of the other companions, right, Talha, Zubair, and some of the other companions of the Prophet who had heard and had lived with the Prophet, and some of these companions had even given bay'ah to Amirul Mu'mineen Imam Ali himself. When the issue of Saqifa took place, these people were in the house of Amirul Mu'mineen supporting Amirul Mu'mineen Imam Ali. And yet, after 20 years, after 25 years, these people now raise their sword against Imam Ali. And they actually, when they're giving bay'ah, they set a condition. They say, if we give bay'ah to you, then you have to make us your partners in crime, or make us your partners in this khilafat. Amirul Mu'mineen says, then you can be my partners, and you can be my partners in support. You have to support me when the khilafah is my responsibility. Don't think that I can deal and parse out this khilafah to each and every one of you. This battle of Jamal, it takes place, and then this Abu Thabit, this man, he partakes in the battle on the side of Amirul Mu'mineen, and it is said that when the battle ends, Abu Thabit goes to the city of Medina. And he speaks to the wife of the Prophet of Allah, a lady, Salama. And she says to him, فَأَيْنَ كُنْتَ حِينَ طَارَ بِالْقُلُوبِ or طَارَتِ الْقُلُوبِ مَطَائِرَهَا. Where were you in the battle? When everybody was all full of confusion, they saw the companions of the Prophet on one side and other companions on the other. And people were in this state of confusion. Do we listen to these companions or do we listen to these companions? Do we listen to the wife of the Prophet or do we listen to the cousin and the son-in-law of the Prophet, who we had heard that the Prophet had given the khilafat to after he had passed? This is a very important point. Unfortunately, we don't have time to elaborate on it too much. But when we say irtadda an-nas ba'da an-nabi illa thalath or illa khams, this is not just exaggeration. That all of the people, they did irtidad after the Prophet. There's some of these ahadith that we have. That all of the people, they basically reneged and went against the Prophet's word after he passed away, except for just a few people. This was because the hujjah was completed for the community, for the people of Medina in particular, and for the rest of the Muslim community in general. And that's why some of these battles of Ridda, these people from the far corners of the Muslim Ummah, they now are questioning their allegiance to the Khilafat after the Prophet's death. So this is not necessarily an exaggeration, right? These are historical points and historical facts that maybe we can talk about at some other point. Coming back to the story. So Salama, she asks this Abu Thabit, where were you when the battle was taking place? He says, فَقُلْتُ إِلَىٰ أَحْسَنِ ذَلِكَ. I was in the best possible place. كشف الله ذلك عني حين زوال الشمس فقاتلت قتالا شديدا مع أمير المؤمنين. And God, He opened my eyes and He let me see, and I fought a very difficult battle along the side of Amirul Mu'mineen حتى فرغ, until the battle ended. And then she says, أحسنت. She says, you did a very good job. سمعت رسول الله. I have heard that the Prophet of Allah, he said, يقول إن عليا مع القرآن والقرآن مع علي لا يفترقان حتى يرد علي الحوض. That Ali is with the Quran and the Quran is with Ali. They will not separate until they come back to me at the hawd, at the pool of Kawthar. So the first part makes sense usually. Aliyun ma'al Quran, that Ali is with the Quran. That whatever the Quran says, then Ali is going to be with it. But then the second part, wal Qur'ana ma'aliyan, that the Quran actually follows Ali. That is a little bit more difficult to understand. And at least one dimension, or one part of this hadith is this idea that when a person reaches that level of perfection, that level of discernment and that level of wisdom, then God opens up for that person certain things that if I were given and if I were faced with those teachings, then I would accept them. So for example, many of these sayings of Amirul Mu'mineen, you can find sayings about patience, about wisdom, about courage, very similar to what you find in Nahjul Balagha. But they're just a little bit better. They're just a little bit more eloquent, they're just a little bit more beautiful. But then there are moments in the words of Amirul Mu'mineen, the words of Imam Ali, or even generally in the life of Amirul Mu'mineen, where we find things that go beyond, far above and beyond what normal people could not just get to on their own, but maybe even understand. So, let me give you an example from the Prophet's life. When the Prophet, when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wa was in when he was giving the peace of Hudaybiyah, when he was signing the peace of Hudaybiyah, there was a very famous back and forth, a conflict that arose when they were writing the peace treaty. So you have the mushrikeen on one side and the believers, the Muslimin, and the Prophet himself on the other. The Prophet, he says, Ya Ali, write down Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Begin in these words, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The polytheists, they reject this. They say, we know Allah, but we don't know this ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We don't know these names, these extra names that you are using. So change this. He says, Bismika Allahumma. Use this phrase. And we might think, well, what is the the single principle of Islam? It is Tawheed. It starts, this line, this sentence starts every single surah of the Quran except for one. And even then Allah gives a replacement in another surah. But then the Prophet says, no, we are going to accept what they say. And he changes it. And then he says, in another instance, he says, Hada min Rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, or something in that sense, that this is a treaty from Rasulullah, the Prophet of Allah. And then the polytheists say that if we accepted you as the Prophet of Allah, then we would not have fought you in the first place. And then the Prophet says to Imam Ali to change this as well. So some of the Muslims, they rise up. Some of these very fervent, principled Muslims, they rise up and they say, Na'udhu billah, we will not accept this. This is beyond the pale. In some reports we have that. And then Rasulullah says, you can sit down. I know exactly what I'm doing, the compromise that I am making here. And he continues, and he says, no, write instead Muhammad min Muhammad ibn Abdullah, from Muhammad the son of Abdullah. This is just one of those examples. In the situation, the Prophet has courage, he has bravery, he could have fought the mushrikeen. It is the treaty of Hudaybiyah at the end of the day, but he takes a step back because he sees the circumstances. And then we have the same, very similar cases with the case of Amirul Mu'mineen. Let me give you just one example and then I will end. I've been saying this a little bit, but inshallah this is the last example. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. We have this idea of that the Ahlul Bayt can set certain standards or certain rules that the Muslims would have to obey based on the authority and the wilaya and the imamat of the Ahlul Bayt. And the Ahlul Bayt will sometimes tell us what the limitations and what the extent of these rules are, and sometimes they won't. But these maybe sometimes are rules that go beyond our understanding. They're not just pieces of wisdom or suggestions or lessons. Rather, they seem to be certain rules and certain principles. One example of this is with the Khawarij. Some of you may have heard this before, but in the case of the Khawarij, Amirul Mu'mineen, he was fighting against a rebellious faction from his own people, from his own army. And it is reported in certain places, in particular Nahj al-Balagha as well brings this, that Amirul Mu'mineen says, yes, these Khawarij are very difficult people. They are, in a way, extremists. They were principled, and they don't really know all of the priorities of Islam, but their heart is in the right place. So after I am gone, do not fight against these Khawarij. Take a step back, because their heart is in the right place, they just have gone the wrong direction. And they are very different from a person like Muawiyah, whose heart is filled with evil, and he is now going and destroying the Muslim community. And so Imam Ali says, take a step back from the Khawarij. Let them be after I have gone. In other instances, we have this example in Islamic history. I mentioned these battles of Ridda, where Muslims, after the death of the Prophet, they rejected the central government in Medina. They said that this central government did not ask us for our vote. They did not ask us who we wanted to become the Khalifa of the Muslims. And they just made their own decision. And so we are not going to send our zakat to that central government. There was a debate amongst the Muslims. On the one hand, the Khalifa was saying that these are now murtad. These are people outside of the fold of Islam, and now we are going to attack them. And we're going to plunder even some of their wealth, and they are basically beyond the fold, beyond the pale. There was another faction within the group, the circle of the Khalifa. They said that no, these are still Muslims. And we have no precedent from the Prophet's life to allow for Muslims being killed in this way. But then the Khalifa's word prevailed. And they went out and they killed and they plundered and they took and they pillaged and all of the things that you might think about in war. Now the time comes for Amirul Mu'mineen. He has the same type of issue. Rebellion and people who are now killing as well. And Amirul Mu'mineen is faced with the same problem. It is said that Amirul Mu'mineen tells his soldiers that these Khawarij, they are still Muslim. And after the battle of Nahrawan had finished, he said that whatever treasure you have taken from these people, return it back unto them. Don't take this treasure or this wealth and think as though that these are now kuffar and this treasure is yours and you can take it and you do it with it as you please. This had no precedent during the time of the Prophet. And the precedent that had been set was set in the opposite direction, that whatever you take is free game. But Amirul Mu'mineen now comes and he establishes a different precedent. And he says that this is the rule for how you deal with rebellion and infighting amongst Muslims. And so we see that even in our situation and our circumstances, 1,400 years, sometimes we think that all of those things, that history is irrelevant to our time and our day and age. But we see that our ulama, they translate for us those same principles of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Outside of the school of the Ahlul Bayt even, when we look in some of the scholars of other schools of Islam, they say that we learned how to deal with Muslims fighting Muslims through the action and the sunnah of Ali, not through the action and the sunnah of anybody else. Because if we looked at those actions, then things would be very different. And we see the same thing happening, unfortunately. Principled people, Muslims as they call themselves, with all of the values of Islam, now going and finding, you might have heard about these stories, finding people who are now under their thumb, and then going and massacring thousands and thousands of these people, women, children, men, elderly, whatever human being they find, they will go and massacre them, and then they'll take pictures of themselves and display it for the world to see. These so-called Muslims, their people they're fighting might not even be Muslim. But who said that we can ransack and we can massacre and we can genocide a people as we see fit? That is not the principles of Islam. And so we take our motto and we take as our example Amir al-Mu'mineen. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Aliyun ma'al haq wal haqqu ma'a Ali. Yes, Imam Ali is our way to the truth. But as well, when the truth is unclear for us, then we look at the action of Imam Ali. Even though sometimes we might not understand the wisdom immediately, and later on that wisdom becomes clear to us. Pray to Allah that Allah allows us to understand the hikmah and the teachings of Amirul Mu'mineen and the children of Amirul Mu'mineen. And oh Allah, give us the opportunity to share these teachings with our families, with our children, to allow us to share the stories of the Ahlul Bayt and to try to reflect on these stories and try to implement them in our lives and in the lives of our families. And inshallah, we will end with this dua that has been recommended for the final nights of Ramadan, the final 10 nights. This is a dua in one version or another has been mentioned in many of our books of hadith. We can stand up and then recite this dua and then end with a ziyarat. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Is that the microphone? Do you have it? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم إنك قلت في كتابك المنزل شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن هدى للناس وبينات من الهدى والفرقان فعظمت حرمة شهر رمضان بما أنزلت فيه من القرآن وخصصته بليلة القدر وجعلتها خيرا من 1000 شهر. اللهم وهذه أيام شهر رمضان قد انقضت ولياليه قد تصرمت وقد سرت يا إلهي منه إلى ما أنت أعلم به مني وأحصى لعدده من الخلق أجمعين فأسألك بما سألك به ملائكتك المقربون وأنبياؤك المرسلون وعبادك الصالحون أن تصلي على محمد وآل محمد وأن تفك رقبتي من النار وتدخلني الجنة برحمتك وأن تتفضل علي بعفوك وكرمك وتتقبل وتقربي وتستجيب دعائي وتمن علي بالأمن يوم الخوف من كل هول أعددته ليوم القيامة. إلهي وأعوذ بوجهك الكريم وبجلالك العظيم أن ينقضي أيام شهر رمضان ولياليه ولك قبلي تبعة أو ذنب تؤاخذني به أو خطيئة تريد أن تقتصها مني لم تغفرها لي. سيدي سيدي سيدي، أسألك يا لا إله إلا أنت، إذ لا إله إلا أنت، إن كنت رضيت عني في هذا الشهر فازداد عني رضا، وإن لم تكن رضيت عني فمن الآن فارضى عني. يا أرحم الراحمين، يا الله يا أحد يا صمد، يا من لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد، يا ملين الحديد لداود عليه السلام، يا كاشف الضر والكرب العظام عن أيوب عليه السلام، أي مفرج هم يعقوب عليه السلام، أي منفس غم يوسف عليه السلام، صل على محمد وآل محمد كما أنت أهله أن تصلي عليهم أجمعين، وافعل بي ما أنت أهله ولا تفعل بي ما أنا أهله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. We'll end with a ziyarat. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم أنت السلام ومنك السلام ولك السلام وإليك يعود السلام. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليك